Mark and Lisa Sanders were the kind of couple people envied. Adventurous, fit, always chasing the next trail, the next vista, the next challenge. They'd met on a group hike in Joshua Tree in the late 90s, bonded over a shared love of wild places, and married 2 years later beneath a sandstone arch. By 2003, they were seasoned weekend explorers from Big Sur Cliffs to the Red Canyons of Utah, but the Mojave Desert had always called to them in a different way. Stark, untamed, endless. On June 12, 2003, they set out from their home in Pasadena, California, packed for a long weekend. The plan was loose, as it often was with them. Head toward the Providence Mountains, explore side trails off the Mojave Road, and maybe camp a night under the stars. Mark left a voicemail for his brother that morning. Out to the desert for a few days, back Sunday. Lisa emailed a coworker a photo of their Jeep packed to the roof. Our trusty ride into the wild. Friends weren't worried when Sunday came and went, with no word. Cell reception was patchy out there. Delays happened. But when Monday morning arrived and Lisa didn't show up to her job at the art gallery, when Mark didn't clock in at his tech firm, worry sharpened into alarm. By Monday night, family had called the Mojave National Preserve, reporting them overdue. Rangers found no sign of them at the visitor center logs, no campsite registered, no known route. The search started at dawn Tuesday. Helicopters skimmed the canyons, ground teams fanned out. The desert was merciless. Temperatures spiked past 110 degrees F that week, the sun a pale white knife overhead. Days passed. The Sanders families waited, clinging to hope, but there were no tire tracks to follow, no footprints, no discarded water bottles or scraps of gear. Mark and Lisa had vanished into a landscape that swallowed stories whole. And as days turned into weeks, the question wasn't just where they were. It was, how does a couple vanish so completely, leaving behind no map, no message, no goodbye? The gas station attendant remembered them first. A couple in their 30s, sun-kissed, laughing, grabbing Gatorades and a map from the rotating stand by the register. June 12th, mid-afternoon, Mark joked about getting lost on purpose and asked if there was a scenic route through the Providence Mountains. Lisa smiled politely, watching as her husband traced a finger over the map. They paid cash, waved, and drove off a dark green Jeep Cherokee rattling toward the horizon. A park ranger recalled seeing them later that evening near the Mojave Road turnoff. The Jeep pulled over briefly near a dusty trail marker. Mark stepped out, looked around, stretched his legs. Lisa sat inside, scribbling in a notebook. The ranger thought nothing of it. Couples stopped like that all the time. A wave, a nod, headlights back on, gone. An RV camper parked for the night at Sunrise Rock swore he saw them just as the sun was setting. He remembered because they stopped to admire his setup, a vintage Airstream, polished like a mirror. They chatted briefly. Mark asked if the road ahead was rough. The man said yes, warned of narrow gullies. Lisa laughed and said, "Well, that's what adventure's for." They thanked him, drove off. That was the last time anyone saw them. The official timeline ends there. June 12th, 2003, roughly 7:40 p.m., a green Jeep Cherokee heading east toward a part of the Mojave few dare explore without caution. No reports after that, no calls for help, no sightings by other campers or hikers. For weeks, investigators traced the thin threads left behind. They interviewed the gas station clerk twice. They walked the trailhead where the ranger saw them. They canvassed campsites, gas stops, side roads, but nothing materialized. No one reported a stranded vehicle. No one heard a distress call on a radio. It was as if the desert opened its jaws and quietly erased them. Years later, the ranger would admit that sometimes he wondered about that night, about the Jeep's brake lights fading into the dusk, about whether if he'd stopped them, warned them, told them not to go further, anything might have changed. Mark always loved finding the unmarked trails, the ones only old-timers or rockhounds talked about over beers. In the weeks before the trip, he dug deep into desert forums, scanned satellite images, cross-referenced scraps of information from hiking blogs. Lisa had watched from the couch, amused, as he printed out blurry maps and circled faint lines near the Providence Mountains. Do we really need to be that off-grid? She teased, and Mark had only grinned. That's where the magic is. The Providence Mountains rise sharp and sudden from the flat, sun-baked floor of the Mojave. Between their jagged limestone ridges, narrow canyons snake inward, some leading to spring-fed oases, others to dead ends and sheer drop-offs. There's an official trail system near Mitchell Caverns, but Mark wasn't interested in the official routes. According to the notes he left behind, they planned to follow a faint track running parallel to Fauché Pass, an old mining path that hadn't been maintained in decades. It wasn't on visitor maps, but Mark had traced its rough line on their personal printouts, highlighting places marked possible water and shelter, rock arch. Lisa had annotated too, jotting little notes in the margins, remember sunscreen, check GPS battery. By the time they left the main road, they were chasing something few travelers bothered with, solitude so complete it felt like discovery. They passed no signs, no other vehicles, no markers, but the occasional sun-bleached cairn half collapsed in the dust. Somewhere past Fauché Wash, they would have left the jeep to hike on foot, shouldering packs loaded with water, protein bars, electrolyte tablets, a small first aid kit, and Mark's battered Nikon camera. To them, it was the perfect kind of escape, close enough to civilization to feel safe, remote enough to believe they were alone in the world. But what Mark and Lisa didn't know was that parts of that landscape had changed. Flash floods had rerouted some washes, rockfalls had blocked old tracks, and the trail they were following, if it could even be called a trail, led straight into one of the most unforgiving pockets of the Mojave. They weren't lost yet, but they were walking toward a place where even the desert itself seemed to thin, leaving nothing but stone, heat, and silence. The summer of 2003 was brutal across the Southwest. News anchors rattled off record-breaking highs. Ranchers watched their wells dry up. Hikers pulled back plans or postponed trips altogether. By June 10th, temperatures in the Mojave were spiking over 110 degrees F and climbing. At the Kelso Depot Visitor Center, park staff posted laminated signs at the entrance. Heat advisory in effect, limit outdoor activity between 10 and 5 p.m. Inside, rangers urged visitors to carry double the usual water, wear sun-protective clothing, and avoid backcountry routes. A local store near Baker set out a sandwich board reading simply, "Stay off the trails, heat kills." But not everyone listens. Mark and Lisa had checked in at a gas station just outside the preserve's edge, smiling and joking, unfazed by the warnings. The gas station clerk later recalled mentioning the heat, waving a hand toward the haze shimmering off the asphalt. "Y'all be careful out there." Mark had given a thumbs up. Lisa had bought extra water bottles. That was it. No one could say they were reckless, they were just, like so many, confident. Seasoned hikers, prepared. But the desert doesn't play fair in a heat wave. Even early morning brings furnace-hot winds. By midday, rocks radiate heat like stovetops, and shade is a lie, a few degrees cooler, maybe, but not enough. Electronics fail. Batteries drain faster. The body's cooling systems lag behind, no matter how much water you drink. Locals remember that week vividly. A park ranger at Mitchell Caverns would later tell investigators how tourists came stumbling in, pale and shaky, after 10-minute walks. An RV camper near Sunrise Rock swore he saw buzzards circling low over the canyons by late afternoon. Even the desert plants looked wilted, their waxy skins dulled under the relentless sun. The Sanders weren't amateurs. They had prepared. They had notes, supplies, gear. But they had also underestimated the single most dangerous force in the Mojave, not the snakes, not the cliffs, not the isolation. It was the heat, and that week, the heat was a predator. By Sunday night, the first flicker of worry surfaced. Lisa's sister, Rachel, had expected a call, just a quick check-in, like always. "We're back. We're safe." It was amazing. Mark usually sent a text with a goofy photo, sunburnt and grinning, boots kicked off by the car. But that night, her phone stayed dark. She told herself it was nothing, no signal. Maybe they decided to camp one more night, soak in the stars. Monday morning, the worry sharpened. Lisa didn't show up for her shift at the gallery. Mark's office called his cell 3 times. It went straight to voicemail. Rachel called their house, no answer. By noon, she left a message on Mark's parents' line, voice tight but steady. "Hey, just checking, have you heard from them? I thought they'd be back by now." By Monday evening, the edges started to fray. Mark's parents dialed ranger stations, trying to mask the rising panic with polite concern. "We're sure it's nothing, just overdue, but could you—" At first the answers were gentle. "They probably just ran late. We see that all the time. Cell towers out there are spotty." But something didn't sit right. Mark and Lisa were spontaneous, sure, but not careless. Not when it came to check-ins. They knew the rules. Leave an itinerary, touch base, confirm return. It wasn't just habit, it was their safety net. And now, that net felt like it was unraveling. By nightfall, Rachel made the call she'd been dreading. "I need to report my sister and brother-in-law missing." On the other end, the dispatcher took down the details, names, ages, vehicle description, planned route, any landmarks mentioned. As Rachel spoke, her voice thinned into a whisper. "Please," she said softly, "please find them." At dawn Tuesday, the desert awoke to the sound of rotor blades. A California Highway Patrol helicopter cut low across the landscape, golden light glinting off its fuselage. Below, rangers in khaki uniforms gathered at Kelso Depot, maps spread across hoods of dusty trucks, radios crackling with assignments. The search had begun. They started with the knowns, the last gas station stop, the ranger sighting, the camper's recollection. They swept the main roads, then the side trails, then the dry washes threading between boulders. Teams on foot walked grid patterns through arroyos, calling names into silence. No tire tracks, no footprints, no discarded water bottles or trail markers, no flashes of reflected glass or nylon to catch the sun. The air itself felt hushed, as if the desert were holding its breath. The Jeep Cherokee was the key. Find the vehicle, and they'd narrow the search. But hours stretched into a full day, and there was no trace, not wedged under brush, not buried in sand. It was as if the earth had swallowed it whole. Back at command, the mood shifted. Rangers who'd started with calm determination now worked with clipped voices, tight jaws. This wasn't supposed to happen, not to experienced hikers, not to people who knew better. But the Mojave has no memory, no mercy. By Wednesday, more teams were called in search and rescue dogs, thermal drones, volunteers from neighboring counties. But the story was already taking on the shape that searchers dread. The vanishing, the sudden erasure, the sense that whatever trail Mark and Lisa left had been swept clean. By Thursday, one ranger quietly admitted to another, "It's like they were never here." It was a sheriff's deputy who spotted it first. 2 weeks after Mark and Lisa vanished, a patrol car rolled slowly down a narrow service road, a shortcut locals used near Fauché Wash. The deputy wasn't looking for the Jeep anymore. The official search had already been scaled back, but when the glint of metal caught in the corner of his eye, something made him stop. There, under the tangled shade of a mesquite tree, half swallowed by sand and brush, sat the green Jeep Cherokee. Dust coated the windshield in a thick gray film. A scattering of leaves lay plastered against the wipers. Its tires were half deflated, one pressed deep into soft earth, as if it had been abandoned mid-turn and never moved again. The deputy approached cautiously. His hand hovered over his belt, instinct more than suspicion. Coyotes skittered somewhere nearby. The air buzzed with heat. He called it in first, gave coordinates, then edged forward. The driver's side window was cracked halfway. Inside, the keys dangled from the ignition, glinting faintly in the sun. No Mark, no Lisa. Backup arrived within the hour. Crime scene tape was stretched loosely between the scrub. Cameras flashed. A search perimeter was set. They checked for signs of distress, slashed tires, broken glass, forced entry. Nothing. The Jeep was locked except for the cracked window. No sign of struggle, no hint of damage. But there was something eerie in how deliberately it had been parked, tucked, just out of sight from the road, as if intentionally hidden, as if whoever left it there hadn't wanted it found. The odometer showed they'd driven farther than their last known location suggested. They'd gone deeper, past mapped trails, into no man's land. Rangers clustered around the hood, shaking their heads. This wasn't where anyone should have ended up, not by accident. As night fell, headlights pooled over the sand, and deputies leaned against truck beds, silent. Somewhere out there, in the darkened stretch beyond the mesquite and the washes, were two people no one could find, and a desert that wasn't giving up its secrets. The next morning, investigators pried open the Jeep's doors carefully, notebooks ready. What they found was a snapshot frozen in time, a scene both mundane and deeply unsettling. The front seats held 2 empty Gatorade bottles, crumpled snack wrappers, and a sun-bleached road atlas flipped open on the passenger side. The map's pages were curled from heat, ink faded at the edges, but one mark stood out sharp and deliberate, a small X scrawled in blue pen, pinned on a canyon not labeled on any official trail map. In the back seat, they found a half-empty water jug wedged under a pile of gear: hiking boots, a first aid kit, sunscreen, a notebook. Lisa's handwriting appeared in the margins of a folded brochure. "Refill here?" circled in shaky script. Mark's Nikon camera sat atop a jacket, battery dead, lens cap still on. The glove compartment revealed more. Emergency granola bars, a roll of quarters, a lighter. Nothing screamed panic, nothing suggested a rush. And yet the scene pulsed with a strange tension, like they had paused here, regrouped, made a plan, and then left. A forensic tech leaned in, nose wrinkling at the heat-stale air. "No sign of overnighting," he murmured. "No sleeping bags unrolled. No evidence of a night spent huddled in the car. They hadn't sheltered here. They'd left it, walked away, into a landscape no one could yet trace." The marked canyon became the search's new focus. Old-timers were called in, desert guides who knew every fault line and dry streamed for miles. Some nodded slowly, recognizing the name from mining maps decades old. "Bad place to get lost," one muttered. Why had Mark and Lisa marked it? Were they drawn to it, or had they been forced off course? No one knew. But one thing was certain. The Jeep hadn't broken down. It hadn't been abandoned in a storm or stolen and dumped. Mark and Lisa had walked away into heat, into silence, into a place even the map tried to forget. As soon as the Jeep was found, the theories began. Some were simple. Mark and Lisa had miscalculated, tried to cut across country on an old miner's track they thought would loop back to the main road. Maybe they believed the unlisted canyon marked on their map held water, a spring, a shortcut to safety. The desert is riddled with stories like that, travelers chasing mirages, the promise of shade or a trickle of water that never comes. Others pointed to Mark's nature. Friends called him adventurous, but his brother quietly added, he pushed things. Lisa, too eager to match his drive, determined not to be the cautious one. Did they get too bold, veer too far, refuse to turn back when they should have? And then there were the darker speculations. Online forums lit up with whispers. Was there someone else out there that day? An encounter gone wrong? A stranger on the trail? A hidden camp? A passing car that offered help but meant harm? In the absence of answers, shadows multiply. The desert is a place people go to vanish, and sometimes a place people go to make sure others do. Old-timers weighed in, shaking their heads at the newcomers who underestimated the Mojave's traps. They followed a ghost trail, one man wrote under a news article. That canyon's been swallowing folks since the 50s. Others remembered whispered legends, a prospector's lost mine, a hidden spring marked only by stone cairns, a superstition passed down through campfire talk. The investigators tried to stay grounded. They plotted coordinates, tracked sun exposure, calculated water loss, survival timeframes. But off the record, one ranger admitted, it's like they walked off the edge of the map. The longer the days stretched with no sign, the more the line between logic and myth blurred. Were Mark and Lisa just another cautionary tale, or had they stumbled into something no one could explain? On the 15th day, the families went in front of the cameras. The Sanders parents stood on a makeshift podium in the glare of TV lights, voices trembling but clear. Mark's father, Robert, clutched the microphone in both hands. "We just want them home," he said, his face pale under his sunburnt forehead. "Please, if anyone knows anything, saw anything, come forward. We're begging you." Beside him, Lisa's mother, Mary Ann, held a framed photo. Mark and Lisa at their wedding, cheeks pressed together, smiling. Her voice broke when she spoke. "She's my only daughter," she whispered. "Please help bring her home." The news clips ran on local channels, then national. They flashed the couple's photos, the green Jeep, the search map with its red circles. Hotlines were set up, flyers printed. On social media, hashtags spread, "Find Mark and Lisa," "Mojave missing," "Bring them home." But with the light came noise. Rumors spun through comment sections, wild threads on online forums. Some swore they saw a couple matching their description hitchhiking near Laughlin. Others claimed they'd heard strange transmissions on ham radios, static-laced pleas for help. A desert blogger posted an old legend about disappearances near the unlisted canyon, fueling theories of cults, ghosts, or worse. The families tried to hold steady. They met with search coordinators, scrolled through tip reports, answered calls from strangers promising clues. Behind closed doors, they sat in circles at home, clutching mugs of untouched coffee, staring at the door as if any second it might swing open and end the nightmare. But by the end of the second week, something raw had settled in the parents' voices, a quiet, pleading exhaustion. "We just want to know," Robert said softly into a reporter's mic. "Whatever happened out there, we just need to know." In the months after Mark and Lisa vanished, the official investigation slowed, but the stories kept moving. Locals spoke in low tones at bars and gas stations, passing along an old desert legend, a collapsed mining shelter somewhere near the unlisted canyon. It didn't appear on modern maps, only on yellowed survey charts from the early 1900s. Some called it the Hanover Shelter, others the Swallowing Rock, after the way it was said to take in animals, people, anything unlucky enough to seek shade there. Old-timers told of prospectors who'd gone missing in the 50s, a pair of hikers in the 70s, even a group of teens in the late 90s who wandered too deep and came back rattled, refusing to speak of what they'd seen. "It's the kind of place the desert reclaims," one man said, leaning over his beer at a roadside tavern. "You don't find it, it finds you." The shelter sat near a stretch of brittle limestone cliffs, riddled with faults and fractures. Rain would come once a year, maybe less, and soften the earth just enough to shift the rocks, seal the cracks, erase the signs that anyone had been there. The desert was a master at covering its tracks. Some rangers dismissed it as folklore. "We've searched every mapped shelter out there," one said, but others weren't so sure. "There are places we just don't send people," admitted a park biologist quietly. "Places we can't guarantee we'll get you back from." For the families, the legend was one more torment. It dangled a terrible maybe that Mark and Lisa hadn't been lost or taken, but trapped. That somewhere out there, under tons of fallen stone, their story had been buried all along. It was a fluke, the kind that only happens when no one's looking. In May 2011, 8 years after Mark and Lisa vanished, a solo hiker named Joel Ramirez was bushwhacking through a dry creek bed near the old mining routes. He wasn't searching for anything, just testing a new GPS, following game trails. The day was still, the air heavy with desert quiet. Then he saw it. At first, Joel thought it was just a scatter of pale rocks near the base of a sandstone outcrop. But as he got closer, a shape resolved, curved, smooth, unmistakable, bone. He crouched, stomach tight, brushing at the dirt. More pieces emerged, a partial jaw, fragments of long bones, the faint glint of something metallic half buried nearby. Joel froze. His heart pounded so hard he could hear it in his ears. He backed away slowly, marked the GPS coordinates, and hiked out faster this time, sweat cold on his back despite the heat. Authorities arrived the next morning. Under the hard morning light, the scene took shape. The rocky outcrop Joel had stumbled upon wasn't just a formation, it was the collapsed mouth of a rock shelter. Weathered beams jutted from the rubble, sun-bleached and splintered, the last remains of an old mining site long forgotten by maps. Inside the collapse zone, Forensic teams worked carefully, brushing away centuries of dust and stone. What they found chilled even the most seasoned among them. Scraps of fabric matching the Sanders' last known clothing, a cracked camera lens, and a thin gold ring engraved with initials M.L. After 8 long years, the desert had finally given up its first clue, and what had once been a missing persons case was now something darker and far more haunting. By dawn the next day, the quiet of the Mojave was broken. Sheriff's deputies rolled in first 3 SUVs crunching over the dry wash, dust kicking up behind them like a trailing comet. They marked off the area with bright yellow tape, strung between mesquite branches and rusted fence posts, a jarring slash of color against the muted desert. Then came the forensic teams, stepping carefully from their vans, lugging cameras, shovels, bags of evidence markers. Joel Ramirez stood to the side, arms folded tight, watching as the professionals took over the place he had stumbled into by accident. He hadn't slept. He kept hearing the sharp crack of his own voice when he'd called it in. "I think I found human remains." By mid-morning, a small command post had been set up, a folding table under a tarp. Walkie-talkies buzzing, maps spread wide. The old mining site, once just a vague smudge on archival documents, had been transformed into a high-priority scene. Detectives moved in slow circles, murmuring to each other, while deputies fanned out to secure the perimeter. A drone buzzed overhead, capturing aerial footage. The heat pressed down mercilessly, baking the ground, curling the edges of plastic evidence flags. What chilled the investigators most wasn't just the bones, it was the setting. The collapsed rock shelter wasn't near any logical path, wasn't marked on any recreation maps, wasn't somewhere hikers, even lost ones, were expected to end up. You had to go looking for it, or else you had to be led there. And now, under the heavy sun, the shelter waited in silence, half consumed by rubble and time, as if it had been holding its breath for 8 long years. The excavation began cautiously, almost reverently. Forensic techs knelt at the edge of the collapse, brushing away layers of sediment with gloved hands. Each small fragment, bone, cloth, metal, plastic, was logged, photographed, bagged. They worked under an improvised tarp, shading the most sensitive areas from the punishing sun, sweat trickling down their backs as the hours stretched on. Beneath the top layer of rock, they uncovered what had once been the entrance, a narrow, man-sized opening reinforced with rotting timber beams. Inside, it had caved in almost completely, layers of stone pinning down what little remained. But just beyond the mouth, in the slight hollow that hadn't fully collapsed, the chilling picture emerged. 2 sets of remains, side by side. The skeletons were partially preserved, sun-bleached at the edges where light had reached, the rest tangled in shredded clothing. Lisa's gold ring was still on her finger. Mark's watch had cracked but held its face. Between them, a tangle of items, an empty water bladder, a frayed notebook too damaged to read, and most haunting of all, a camera, broken but intact, as if it had been held tightly until the very end. The scene told a terrible story, but it was incomplete. No clear sign of a fall, no evidence of an ambush or attack. Just 2 people, huddled in the last shade they could find, overtaken by a place that did not forgive mistakes. As night fell, the excavation lights flickered on, casting long shadows over the rocks. One detective stepped back, arms crossed, eyes heavy. "They made it farther than we thought," he murmured. And then, softer, "But they never had a chance." The official confirmation came 3 days later. The coroner's office released a brief statement. Dental records matched the recovered remains to Mark Sanders and Lisa Sanders, missing since June 2003. No other human remains were found at the site. 2 sets, no question. For the families, it was the call they had feared and yet longed for. Rachel sat on the edge of her bed, phone clutched to her ear, listening as the detective gently relayed the news. "It's them," he said quietly. "We're sure." She closed her eyes, pressing her fist to her mouth, the weight of 8 years folding in on her all at once. Mark's brother flew in from Portland the next day, meeting with officials behind closed doors. Lisa's parents stayed home, too fragile to face the scene in person. News vans camped at the edge of town, cameras pointed toward the sheriff's office, waiting for a statement. But the families asked for privacy. They wanted the world to pause, just for a moment, and let them grieve. Back at the site, the work continued. Forensic teams mapped the exact positions where the remains had been found. Mark's skeleton was closest to the outer edge, his arms outstretched as if he'd been trying to shield Lisa when the rocks came down. Lisa's smaller frame was partially curled, one hand resting near her side, her wedding band still gleaming under the dust. Among the debris, there was no sign of violence, no indication they had met with anything but the merciless hand of heat and time. The shelter had given them temporary shade, but it had also been their undoing, a place where help would never come, where the radio signals couldn't reach, where the heat never truly broke. The investigators worked in silence that night. The only sounds, the scrape of tools and the low murmur of radios. One deputy later told a reporter, "It felt like they'd been waiting for us all this time." The mystery of where Mark and Lisa were had been answered, but the question of how and why remained. As the excavation team sifted through the shelter, the pieces of Mark and Lisa's final days slowly came to light. The first thing recovered was the GPS unit, cracked, mud-caked, but still recognizable. Forensic techs would later determine the battery had died long before the couple reached the shelter, leaving them to navigate by map and instinct. The unit's plastic casing was warped by heat, the screen shattered. To anyone holding it, it would have been little more than dead weight. Next came the journal pages. They were found tucked inside a Ziploc bag, weather-damaged but partially legible. Lisa's handwriting traced a slow arc from hope to heartbreak. Stuck near canyon. Mark thinks we can find shade, water low. Another entry, shakier. Heat unbearable, waiting for night to move. And finally, just a few faint words near the bottom of the last page. Love you. Always. Near the bodies, the empty water bladder told its own stark truth. They had rationed carefully, every drop counted, every swallow measured. But the Mojave's demands are relentless. You can carry gallons and still fall short. Mark's camera was recovered last, its strap tangled around a jagged stone. The memory card inside was corroded beyond repair, but investigators couldn't help imagining what final images it might have held. The stretch of empty canyon, the cracked earth underfoot, maybe even one last photo of each other, taken in quiet defiance of fear. What haunted the search team most was the absence of signs they had tried to leave. No arrow markers, no SOS messages, no sign they'd attempted to retrace their steps. It was as if, once they reached the shelter, they knew. Back at the command post, the items were laid out carefully on a folding table. GPS, notebook, camera, water pack. A ranger stood over them for a long time, arms crossed, his shadow stretching long in the evening sun. They weren't lost, he murmured almost to himself. They were just gone. It was a forensic tech who found the second set of notes, tucked deep in Mark's backpack, the zipper half melted from sun and time. The pages were brittle, the ink smeared, but under the right light, a story began to surface. Mark had written on whatever scraps he could find, the backs of trail maps, receipt slips, the inside cover of a paperback novel. His handwriting, normally neat, grew shaky as the notes went on. Reach shelter, shade but no signal. Water low, rationing, Lisa sleeping. GPS dead, tried ridge, nothing. A later line, faint but legible, stopped one investigator cold. Lisa weak, keeping her cool as best I can. Night falls soon. There was no anger in the words, no panic. Just a quiet, methodical record of their narrowing world. Heat, thirst, the slow unraveling of options. Mark was a planner, friends had said. A fixer. He must have believed, right up until the end, that he'd find a way out. One of the last scraps held just a single line written at a tilt. Love you, hold on. The techs bagged the pages carefully, as if afraid they'd break under the weight of air. At the command post, they spread the notes out, trying to align them in order. One ranger murmured, "He was trying to leave a map for us." Another shook his head. No, he was trying to leave her a message. In the end, the words were all they had left to give. Piecing together Mark and Lisa's last days was like tracing footprints in windblown sand. Investigators believe they left the Jeep sometime mid-afternoon when the heat was at its worst. The GPS had already failed, but they must have believed the marked canyon led to water, or at least shade. They carried the essentials: water pack, notebook, camera, trail snacks, but the distance was farther than it looked, the terrain crueler. By the time they reached the collapsed shelter, it was dusk. They found brief relief under the fractured stone, bodies cooling as the sun dipped. Mark likely tried the ridgeline. The faint scrape of boot prints suggested an attempted climb, but with no signal, no vantage point, no salvation. Lisa weakened first. Heat exhaustion, dehydration, the desert takes without warning. Mark stayed by her, rationing sips, writing notes, wrapping her in their jackets when the nighttime chill arrived. They held on as long as they could. One forensic specialist described it gently, later in a report. There are no signs of trauma, no struggle, they were together. The last hours were marked not by chaos, but by quiet endurance, two people clinging to each other at the edge of survival, facing the final truth the Mojave offers to all who wander too deep. No one can say when exactly the end came, only that, when it did, the desert folded them into its silence, and for 8 long years it kept them there, waiting. In the weeks after the discovery, geologists were called to the site, slipping between investigators and media crews, clipboards in hand, eyes sharp behind mirrored sunglasses. The collapsed rock shelter was once a mining outpost, barely remembered on century-old surveys. Its walls, they explained, were brittle limestone, laced with fractures invisible to the untrained eye. Over time, rain had seeped into those cracks, freezing and thawing, widening each fault line bit by bit. Desert storms, rare but violent, had swept through the region months before Mark and Lisa's disappearance, loosening earth and stone, weakening the overhang. When the couple arrived, the shelter must have looked sturdy enough. The entrance was tight, the interior shaded, the roof intact from their view. But the geologists could see the truth. It had been a trap waiting to spring. A forensic survey of the rubble showed how it happened. A large section of the upper rock face had sheared away, likely under its own weight, no sudden quake or dramatic shift required. A single, heavy slab, perhaps loosened by the heat itself, expanding in the sun, was enough to bring down everything around it. One expert pointed to the fine silt packed deep between the fallen stones. "That's the giveaway," he murmured. "It wasn't just collapse, it was slow failure." Mark and Lisa had found what they were searching for: shade, shelter, a place to regroup. But the place they trusted had been crumbling long before they ever arrived. And when the final piece fell, no one heard. In the days after the site was cleared, the question emerged, hushed but persistent. Had Mark and Lisa chosen the shelter knowingly, or had they stumbled into it by accident, driven by desperation? The trail they'd followed was faint, a ghost path on no official maps. Some experts argued they must have been led by old signs, a cairn here, a faint tire rut there, enough to suggest the presence of human-made refuge. Maybe Mark, resourceful as ever, had gambled that the mining shelter would offer a last chance, a reprieve from the punishing heat. Others wondered if they'd never meant to find it at all. Perhaps they veered off course, drawn by the shape of the canyon, or mistaking the crumbling outcrop for a natural cave. Maybe they hadn't known it was there until they were standing at its mouth, blinking up at the fractured rock, the only shadow for miles. What's clear is that it became their final stand. Inside the shelter, they could have waited for night, hoped for cooler air, believed rescue was possible. But the desert is vast, and GPS batteries fail, and sometimes the smallest choices, a turn left instead of right, a pause under the wrong ledge, echo the loudest. The search teams debated it quietly, long after the cameras left. Accident or choice, mistake or strategy? In the end, the line blurred. Because in the Mojave, every choice feels like survival right up until the moment it doesn't. As the investigation deepened, one question kept circling back. Why had Mark and Lisa deviated from safer, well-traveled paths? To the search and rescue veterans, it was a pattern they knew too well: overconfidence. It starts small, a decision to cut across a wash instead of following the loop, a belief that experience will outmatch terrain. Mark and Lisa were no amateurs. They had years of backcountry hikes under their belts. But the Mojave isn't like other places. Here, mistakes compound quickly. Experts pieced together their route. They'd left the Jeep behind after marking a canyon on the map, an unlisted path, likely spotted on satellite printouts or old mining blogs. From there, they followed what looked like a shortcut, a route promising a faster loop back toward the main road. But shortcuts in the desert are rarely what they seem. The terrain that appears passable from above dry creek beds, narrow saddles between ridges can turn brutal on foot. Rock slides, sand traps, maze-like gullies all wait just beyond sight. And in June, under a heat dome, every mile costs more water, more energy, more time. Some believe they simply misread the landscape, tricked by optical illusions and sunstroke haze. Others wondered if their judgment was clouded by determination, the belief that if they just kept moving forward, they'd outpace the danger. A geographer reviewing the area put it bluntly: "Out here, the map in your hand and the map on the ground are two very different things." Whether it was overconfidence or miscalculation, the result was the same. They went off-grid, chasing a shortcut that turned into a dead end, deeper into a place no one meant to find. Then came the GPS. Recovered near Mark's body, the device was a compact handheld model, popular with hikers in the early 2000s. It was battered but intact, screen spider webbed with cracks, battery compartment warped by heat. Forensics handed it over to tech specialists, hoping it might hold some record of the route they'd taken: waypoints, breadcrumb trails, saved maps. What they found was sobering. The battery had been defective, prone to rapid drainage under extreme temperatures. Logs showed the device had powered down repeatedly in the days before the couple's disappearance, sometimes rebooting with corrupted data, sometimes displaying incorrect positioning by several miles. In the desert, where landmarks blur and every direction looks the same, a GPS glitch can be the difference between safety and disaster. Investigators believed Mark and Lisa had relied on it to navigate toward the shortcut canyon, unaware the readings were skewed. When it finally failed completely, they were already too far in to easily backtrack. For all their preparation, the extra water, the marked maps, the notebooks and cameras, they had trusted a piece of equipment they didn't know was failing. One GPS analyst summed it up quietly: "They weren't careless, they were just one battery failure away from a way home." In the end, it wasn't lack of skill or bravery that sealed their fate. It was something as small, as merciless, as a dying signal in an unforgiving place. It was the smallest thing, but it hit the hardest. Among the recovered items cataloged and bagged at the site, the battered GPS, the crumpled water bladder, the fragments of a notebook, was a delicate silver necklace. A simple chain with a small turquoise pendant, dulled now with dust and time, but still intact. Forensic staff logged it, tagged it, and placed it carefully in a padded envelope marked "Personal Effects Sanders, Lisa." Weeks later, when the families were called to the sheriff's office to collect the recovered belongings, no one expected the moment to break them. Lisa's mother, Marianne, opened the envelope slowly. Inside, the necklace was still clasped, as if it had never been taken off. Marianne ran her fingers over it, then pressed it to her lips, eyes squeezed shut. "She wore this every day," she whispered, voice breaking. Mark's brother reached over to steady her, but his own hands trembled. It wasn't the hiking gear or the survival tools that pierced the heart. It was this, the piece of Lisa that had followed her into the canyon, into the shelter, into those last hours, and somehow come back when she hadn't. Later, Marianne would wear the necklace, fingers brushing it unconsciously during interviews and memorials. Reporters would mention it in passing, calling it a symbol of loss and remembrance. But for her family, it was simpler than that. It was Lisa. The family kept the necklace in a small velvet box at night, resting it on Lisa's childhood dresser. Some days, they left it closed. Some days, they opened it just to hold it. It was all they had left, and somehow it was enough and never enough at the same time. The camera was the last thing recovered. It was found wedged under a slab of rock near Mark's side, the strap tangled around his arm, the casing cracked but whole. A black Nikon Coolpix, water-damaged, lens clouded with fine dust. Forensic techs handled it delicately, unsure if anything inside had survived. Back at the lab, they worked carefully to extract the memory card, drying it with precision tools, running recovery software that sifted through corrupted files and fragments. And then a flicker. Among the damaged data, a handful of images emerged, blurry, sun-bleached, overexposed, but unmistakably theirs. A shot of the canyon mouth, jagged rock outlined against a burning sky. Lisa's silhouette, small and determined, walking ahead on a narrow trail. Mark's foot propped on a boulder, snapped at an angle like he'd handed the camera to her for a second. And one last image, the most haunting of all. An outstretched hand, fingers partly covering the lens, pale against the failing light. No one knows why Mark kept the camera with him to the end. Maybe to document the landscape, maybe to leave a trail, maybe just because it was familiar, something solid to hold on to when the world fell away. For his family, the recovered images were both gift and wound. They offered no answers, only echoes, glimpses of the final hours, frozen in pixels, reminders of a journey that had begun with laughter and ended in silence. The camera now sits in a glass case at the family home, next to a framed print of the last photo. Visitors often lean in, squinting, searching for something in that outstretched hand, as if it might still be reaching, still trying to hold on. The story hit the news like a spark to dry grass. For 8 years, Mark and Lisa Sanders had been a quiet, painful mystery, a pair of smiling faces on missing posters, a cautionary tale whispered among hikers. But now, with the discovery of their remains and the recovery of their belongings, they were headline news. Local channels aired drone footage of the collapsed shelter, yellow tape flapping in the heat. National outlets ran somber retrospectives, photos from their wedding, snapshots of their last trip, interviews with grieving family members. Online, the forums lit up. Seasoned hikers debated in long, scrolling threads. Was it overconfidence? Equipment failure? Should they have turned back sooner? Were they reckless or just heartbreakingly unlucky? Others pushed back, praising their preparation, their spirit, the way they'd chase something wild and beautiful instead of playing it safe. In hiking groups and desert guide circles, the Mojave itself became the third character in the story. People spoke of its allure, the stark silence, the endless skies, the humbling vastness, but also its indifference. For every sunrise photograph, there was a tale of heatstroke, disorientation, narrow escapes. The Sanders story became both a warning and a love letter to the land they'd loved. Meanwhile, the media cycle kept turning. Reporters crowded the family's front lawns, cameras trained on doorways. Opinion pieces filled weekend magazines, some mournful, some questioning, some quietly critical. But for those closest to Mark and Lisa, none of it mattered. They weren't following hashtags or headlines. They were gathering photos, choosing readings, writing eulogies. For them, the story wasn't about public debate. It was about bringing two people home. The funeral was held on a clear September morning. Friends, family, and even strangers gathered at a small chapel near Pasadena, flowers spilling over the entrance, photographs lined along the walls. Mark's brother spoke first, voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. He shared stories of childhood, of family hikes, of Mark's easy laugh. Lisa's sister followed, her words soft but sure, remembering Lisa's quiet strength, her sketches, the way she saw beauty in small, overlooked places. No one spoke much of the desert. No one needed to. Afterward, a group gathered for a memorial hike in the San Gabriels, a place Mark and Lisa had loved, safer, closer to home. They climbed a gentle trail, shared memories between breaths, left small stones at the summit. Some wore necklaces with turquoise beads in Lisa's honor. One carried Mark's camera, its cracked lens turned skyward. For the families, Closure was a complicated thing. There was relief, yes, to know, to stop wondering, to have a place to mourn. But the sorrow ran deep, an ache stitched through with love. They spoke of it quietly to reporters afterward. "We're grateful they were found," Lisa's mother said, fingers brushing the recovered necklace at her throat. "But we miss them every day." And under the vast, bright sky, they said goodbye, not just to the loss, but to the long years of not knowing. In the months following the recovery, the Mojave National Preserve shifted back to its quiet rhythms, but something subtle had changed. Park officials gave no sweeping press conferences, no formal warnings issued to the public. Instead, small signs appeared near remote trailheads. Area closed for restoration. Barriers were placed across faint paths leading toward the old mining site. On updated maps, the canyon where Mark and Lisa were found was left unnamed, a blank space on the edge of the page. Those close to the case knew why. The shelter collapse wasn't unique. The Mojave is filled with forgotten structures, crumbling mine shafts, eroded caves, rusted equipment half swallowed by earth and time. Trying to fence it all, warn every traveler, would be like roping off the wind. Behind closed doors, rangers spoke in low voices about soft closures, ways to quietly steer visitors elsewhere without drawing attention. Internally, some pushed for clearer communication, for updated trail warnings, for public education on the risks beyond the main routes. But higher up, the stance remained measured. "We don't want to create panic," one park official said quietly to a colleague. "We want to encourage respect." To outsiders, the Mojave looked unchanged. The same breathtaking sprawl of golden light and cracked earth, the same welcome signs at the entrance, the same trail maps sold in the visitor center gift shop. But for those who knew where to look, there were small absences. Paths once marked in pencil were erased. Waypoints once shared among guides were left unspoken. It wasn't denial, it was something older, more familiar to desert people, a quiet acknowledgement that some places are best left alone. Long after the news vans packed up and left, the locals remained those who called the desert home, those who knew its sharp edges and soft mysteries. In roadside diners and weathered ranch houses, people spoke of the Sanders with the kind of sorrow reserved for stories that feel both distant and too close. And always, as their names were spoken, others surfaced too. The couple who vanished near Devil's Playground in '87, the solo backpacker last seen on the Kelso Dunes Trail in '94, the off-roader who sent one last radio call from SEMA Dome and was never heard again. The Mojave has always held its own list of the missing, a quiet roll call of wanderers and dreamers, seasoned hikers and first-time travelers. Some are found, weeks or years later, bones picked clean by sun and time. Others simply dissolve into the landscape, their names known only to families and the thin paper files in ranger stations. Locals don't speak of these things with fear exactly, more with a kind of respect. A knowledge that the desert is not a place you conquer, it's a place you negotiate with, moment by moment, water bottle by water bottle, mile by mile. At the edge of Baker, a gas station clerk folded up the news clipping about Mark and Lisa, slipping it behind the counter with others from years past. "They weren't careless," he murmured. "Just in the wrong place at the wrong time." And out in the wide, empty expanse, the wind blew through arroyos and over dunes, soft and endless, carrying secrets no one would ever fully know. It's a question that lingers long after the last search party packs up, after the headlines fade, after families fold away maps and photographs into quiet drawers. Why do we keep going back? Why do we chase wilderness, knowing what it can take? For some, it's the beauty, that raw, unfiltered beauty no photograph can fully hold. A sunrise over the dunes, the hush of wind through a Joshua tree forest, the way stars unfurl over the desert like spilled diamonds. It's the pull of something bigger, something ancient, that makes daily life feel small in the best of ways. For others, it's the test, the edge, the feeling of standing at the boundary between comfort and survival, between knowing and uncertainty. To walk into a place where your skills, your choices, your resilience truly matter. Mark and Lisa were part of that lineage, not reckless, not thrill-seekers, but drawn to that quiet challenge, that deep breath of this is real. And then there are those who search. The rangers, the volunteers, the families who refuse to stop looking. They walk the hard miles, not just for closure, but for connection, to say you mattered, you were loved, we did not forget you. The desert humbles us. It reminds us we are temporary. And maybe that's why we return, not to conquer it, but to meet it, to stand at its edge and understand, even for a moment, what it means to be alive, to risk, to lose, and sometimes, if we're lucky, to be found. The last chapter of the search ends without fanfare. No plaques, no markers, no tour guides pointing out the site. Just a collapsed rock shelter, sun-bleached and crumbling, tucked deep in a canyon few will ever visit. The wind moves through it now, threading through the jagged beams, stirring fine dust that settles in soft drifts. Scrub brush leans into its shadows. Lizards dart along the fractured stone, their small lives indifferent to the weight of human stories. From a distance, it looks like nothing, just another scar in a landscape full of them. But up close, if you stand quietly, you can almost feel it. The echo of two people's final hours, the hush of a place that witnessed something it will never tell. Mark and Lisa's families have gone home. The searchers have moved on. The news has found new stories. But the shelter remains, holding its silence, marked only by time and weather and the restless hum of the desert itself. It is, in the end, a grave with no headstone. A testament not just to loss, but to the pull of places like this, places that promise beauty and risk in equal measure, that take as easily as they give, that remind us how thin the line is between presence and absence. Under the wide Mojave sky, the shelter waits, quiet, still, watching. This story was intense, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.